Well, it seems like retro gaming is suddenly making a comeback, with a lot of retro revival games coming out and a lot of nostalgia going around and a lot of people wanting to collect those old games that they wanted to play, or just people that are new to it wanting to go into a massive library of games just waiting for them. I think the question that's been going around is, how does one actually get into retro gaming in the first place? As someone that's been collecting games for a few years now, and knows at least a little bit about it, I would like to share my knowledge and kind of make a little series just explaining to people how they can get into retro gaming and game collecting as a whole. One of the most important things with retro gaming is understand what way you're going to be playing the games. Whether that be through emulation, whether that be through original hardware, what screen you're playing on, what controller you're using. All of these kind of come together as an essential decision that you should be making when you start getting into retro games. Because if you go in haphazardly and go halfway into emulation, but then hear somebody talk about original hardware and you invest way too much money into original hardware when you realize that you don't like original hardware that much, you're stuck at a loss. And so that's why I'm finding it important to make kind of the first episode of this series just about the methods of play and the pros and cons of each one, so that you can make an informed decision about what you're going to do. So anyways, let's get started. Emulation is how I started back when I had no money of my own to spend on original hardware or games. The first pro of emulation is also the most obvious. It's cheap. Do you have any computer at all? It can probably play the entire library of games existing up until the 32-bit era. I was able to get through my first playthrough of Super Mario 64 on a G4 iMac, which is a computer from 2004. One thing I should note, as my legal advisors are telling me currently, is that I should say a major con with emulation is that downloading ROMs is technically software piracy, and that I only advise downloading and playing ROMs for games that you already have in your collection, unless obviously it's classified as abandoned. And what I was mentioning before fits perfect with the second major advantage of emulation, which is versatility and freedom of choice that you have. First, you can do what I did in order to play Super Mario World on my HD TV. You can build your own hardware specifically for emulating retro games. And with the wealth of microcomputers available now, such as the Odroid and Raspberry Pi, this is easier than ever. Not to mention that even up to GameCube-era emulation is possible on a cheap Dell Optiplex and a low-end GPU thrown in if you know something about building computers. Which is nicknamed Legos for adults for a reason. It's just really easy to learn. If the software end is more your thing, then modding what you already have has gotten easier and easier over time. Here's a look at the RetroArch website. Notice something interesting? Yeah, you can mod your GameCube to emulate a huge library of games. Or maybe you want to mod a Wii to do tons and tons of things, including emulation. Speaking of which, Wii modding also has a rich community in it, and the hardware is a trip to the thrift store and $15 away. Honestly, one of the cheapest options I've come by. Something I thoroughly enjoyed doing in high school was jailbreaking a PSP in order to emulate an impressive amount of games. It's incredibly easy to do, and there's tutorials all over the place for pretty much any PSP model that you can think of. And to boot, the PSP natively plays the entire original PlayStation library. I have heard that the PS Vita, when modded, is a great evolution of this little handheld emulation powerhouse, but I just don't have it in my budget to see for myself just yet. Maybe we'll see in a future video. Basically what I'm trying to say here is that your options for emulation are almost unlimited. ROM hacks and translations are pretty much the main reason I still do a lot of emulation to this day. Hey, you want to play a sequel to Super Mario 64 made by a fan? We've got that.
Let's go!
Want to play an obscure RPG that was never released in America, but you don't know any Japanese? No problem. Fan translations are abound everywhere. However, there is an essential problem with emulation. It's not always going to be one-to-one accurate. Sound might be off, there's definitely glitches, input lag is certainly a thing. Also, I kind of forgot to mention the fact that you're not necessarily playing on the original hardware, the experience is just not going to be the same. A lot of this has to do with just the software itself. The software has to do something pretty impressive. Basically make your hardware pretend that it's a completely different type of hardware. And when the architecture of older game consoles is so drastically different from PCs, it can get a little bit hard to do. Especially with things like the GameCube and the Dreamcast and the Sega Saturn. It's just not always going to be the same. But for some people, that's totally acceptable. One final thing I should mention is that much of these cons can be avoided by buying ports and official re-releases of these games on modern consoles. But again, that is only limited by what is released and what hardware you personally own. Also, I kind of forgot to mention, just because these people don't really matter to me, you will deal with original hardware elitists that demand that we game collectors and the entire retro gaming community gatekeep emulation-only folk out. But my response to gatekeeping is always,
piss off.